Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 18 of Self Pub Sunday. Today, we're joined by Andrew Meredith. Andrew is SPFBO 9 author of Deathless Beast, SPFBO 8 semifinalist for Thrice, and newly entered SFINC SFINC, the new novella competition with Fleeting Word.
Yes.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate.
I am really excited for this chat. I think I got all of your, at least recent accolades out there. Did I miss anything?
Nope, that's it. We'll get there. There's years to come.
Yes. So, as a fun icebreaker, while people kind of trickle in, get settled in, we have recently discovered that we have a similar favorite movie.
Yes.
That Thing You Do, which is a classic.
Yes.
What is your favorite moment from that movie?
That's very hard to decide because I can quote the whole movie front and back. It's one of three movies that's like the most quoted movies in our household, and along with Young Frankenstein and Tombstone. But oh man, my favorite. You know what? I'm going to be sentimental and say that I think the kiss at the end is absolutely timeless. It still hits me. We just watched it again for the 100th time, and he asks, a character asks another character, when's the last time you've been decently kissed? And he kisses her, and she kind of gives that was better than the last one, and you feel it. It's just such there's so many, there's kiss here, kiss there in all movies, but it's just such an authentic moment that you didn't even realize. If it's your first time watching, you don't realize that relationship is happening as much as you do on rewatch and rewatch and rewatch. And it's like, it's so there. It's so the story of the movie that the authenticity is so palpable, in the same way that Casablanca has that palpability to it, because it was filmed, weirdly enough, in chronological order. They wrote the scripts day of, so none of the characters know what's happening all the way up until the end. You don't know what's happening. They don't know what's happening. And so there's an authenticity in their acting. I think the same thing happened with That Thing You Do. It's so many line drops, but it's such an authentic movie.
Yeah. For me, the scene that always stands out whenever I think of that movie is the moment they had their radio debut.
Yes.
And you get that image of Liv Tyler licking the stamps, and then they come on the radio.
Yep. Yeah, and you're right there with them. I am Spartacus! Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It just had like quality writing in that movie. You could tell, some movies you can tell the writing is good versus the actors making the writing look good. But in that movie, it was just a perfect combination of really fantastic writing with great actors to bring that writing to life.
I think I saw an interview with Tom Hanks deciding how he was casting everybody. And of course, before you've even seen an interview that he was supposed to play Guy, but he's too old, because Guy is Tom Hanks, Guy Patterson. And he had been his wife was very involved in the casting too. And he was sending her recordings of people who were trying out. And he was going to bypass Tom, what is his last name? But Tom, the actor who played Guy Patterson, he's going to bypass him. And he sent it to his wife, and she goes, "You're hiring him." She said, "Why?" He said, "Why?" She said, "Because he's literally you."
Yeah.
And it was like, he hadn't even computed. And the more he looked at it, he's like, "Oh yeah, this is so me." And it works. That's why it works so well, because it's such a perfect example. Like, we blame authors of writing in Gary Sue's or Mary Sue's. There is a time and a place for it.
Right.
And when it's handled well, which I think Tom Hanks did, he wrote in a stand-in for himself that wasn't a Mary Sue, right? Because he had flaws, because he had strengths. Yeah. And so it's a successful example, I think, of why we all nag on Mary Sue's and Gary Sue's is because they do fall short, because we want that time when it does work so badly, and that movie accomplished it, I think. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to use that transition to talk about your writing career.
Mm-hmm.
So Andrew, have you always wanted to be a writer, or did you have one moment in your life where you're like, this is what I want to do?
Yes, it was back. I mean, I've wanted to be a writer since 93, 95, when I was 10, 11, 12 or so. And I had just read Belgariad as a kid. And speaking of Gary Sue's, my main characters back then as a teenager were absolutely stand-ins for myself. And I do quite a bit of readjustment later on in my writing career to remove that surgically. So I always wanted to do that. And in fact, I sent a proposal to Tor, or might have been Del Rey, but I sent a proposal to Tor of the story I was going to write. This is like 95. And I hadn't written it yet, but I knew it was going to be good. And so they just needed to finance my writing. They never replied.
Huh,
it's interesting. I don't know why.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of your writing inspirations, or I like to call them writing heroes.
Yeah. When I look back at everything, there's a lot of early inspiration from, say, like Belgariad and Dragonlance, excuse me, that I feel I had to decouple myself from. And that kind of, and I read some Hobb at the end of the 90s. No, it would have been like 2000 or so. I was working at Barnes & Noble and read the Farseer trilogy, which, is mind-blowing, and it kind of spoiled me because I couldn't find anything else that I wanted to read after that point that didn't feel too campy, at least to me. And because I wasn't really looking as hard as I probably could have. But I had, was too busy to read because I was working for years, and then had kind of another time I was working at a bookstore, Barnes & Noble in Bellevue, where I was trying to find stuff to read and I just couldn't because everything just looked boring to me. And so I kind of quit fantasy at the time entirely. This was 2009, and was reading Pillars of the Earth. So I basically switched off of fantasy onto a bunch of other things like Pillars of the Earth, Name of the Rose. Read my first and only horror I'll probably ever read, which was I Am Legend, which is absolutely worth it, reading that anthology. So I did a lot of other things I was reading. And then someone handed me Mistborn. So, which was in the same way that Sanderson talks about how Hobb was his hope that was given to him. He wanted to quit fantasy and even reading it. And then someone handed him Hobb and he's like, oh, there is good fantasy. That doesn't mean there wasn't good fantasy, but he wasn't finding it. And right. Hobb opened that window for him. Excuse me. See, Sanderson did the same thing for me with Mistborn. And, just like I can sit and enjoy and critique J.K. Rowling and other authors that I've read, I can criticize and still enjoy Sanderson in a way that I will 100% hand Mistborn 1 to anybody who's never read fantasy before. I wouldn't hand them Way of Kings necessarily. In fact, I'm always surprised when I meet somebody who's never read fantasy and the first fantasy they ever read was Way of Kings and they loved it. I'm like, who are you? This is unprecedented.
It's like a superpower.
Right. So those are probably my primary inspirations. I've had more that have happened even just in the last 5 years. I had a year of audiobooks because I was driving hour and a half total every day to work, and was discovered because it was pre-COVID. There was no choice for audiobooks not a large breadth of audiobooks to choose from the library. But it did have a decent enough for me to go through a whole year of Brian McClellan, Lois McMaster Bujold, a re-listen of Hobb, and then getting to finally do the Live Ship Traders. And there was somebody else. Elie Modesett, in his Imager trilogy, the first three in the Imager portfolio. So that was like a whole year. And of course, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So that was one whole year where I did all of those, and what a great year. And as I was in the middle of writing and trying to get agents, and so it was just very much newness to me, which allowed me to kind of fold it into the dough and become part of not necessarily what inspires what I write, but is something for me to pursue, something to live up to, is what those have been more for me. So yeah, that's the wide breadth of my inspirations.
Side question.
Yeah.
How was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Noel on audiobook?
Oh, very good.
Because I read the big chunker paperback, and I loved it, but I didn't have an audiobook, and I feel like it would have made it even so much more better.
It is now finally, I think, on like Hoopla and stuff. I had to do it by disc in my truck, and so it was like 20 discs.
Right.
Simon Preble is the reader. Simon Preble, who's fantastic, and I think I had listened to a few of his. Yeah, I think he's one of two narrators I enjoy listening to PG Woodhouse on. Simon Preble and I can't remember the other one, but I love PG Woodhouse. But Simon Preble is actually my second and not close second choice for listening to PG Woodhouse, because he is very dry, and so when he reads, like, if you've read any PG Woodhouse, Wooster is a flibbertigibbet. So the other reader I really like reads him as an absolute flibbertigibbet, and Preble reads him as a straight-laced Pan Pacific, very this thing happened, and just very straight. Now that worked and translated so well into Jonathan Strange, and he folded in the footnotes beautifully. Like, you're in the middle of a story, and then he drops to footnote and then comes back in. So whoever directed it and produced it to make sure when they were supposed to go in, you don't miss a beat. And I love the footnotes. The footnotes are some of the best parts about that book.
Right.
So yes, it is worth your time.
We're like almost equivalent to like Terry Pratchett footnotes, where like you
some
could
of
just
them are full short stories,
and it was like a book in itself, just combining all footnotes together.
I'm not convinced that Ladies of Grace Adieu is not just footnotes that didn't make it into the book. Because that's basically how most of the footnotes play out, right? Is that you get these short stories that have nothing to do with the plot, but they do. And that's such a wonderful book. Anybody who hasn't, it's not Frederick Davidson, Trisha, my wife. It's I'll think of it.
Probably when you're trying to fall asleep tonight.
Exactly.
Okay,
Simon, Cecil, Jonathan Cecil. That's who it is. If you're going to read PG Woodhouse, always start with the Jonathan Cecil of anything, whether it's Jeeves and Wooster or P. Smith or do Jonathan Cecil. Okay.
So I want to talk about Deathless Beast now. I want to give this some airtime since it has been entered into SPFBO 9. It's a lot of letters there, and my brain always mixes them up. So I want to start talking spoiler-free first for those that haven't read Deathless Beasts yet, but are maybe interested in reading it. So can you give us kind of your elevator speech for what Deathless Beast is all about?
Yeah. Deathless Beast is a multi-POV epic fantasy that follows a pair of sibling mercenaries who are just trying to kind of get ahead in the world, and they kind of act as our entry point into the world, versus other POVs are like Jenny Brostein as a paladin who has had a very colorful past, but is kind of settled into his life as a paladin and is out of the blue called to become the champion of his god. And so there's a whole theme there of whether he's worthy of even that. And of course he questions that. And so he's trying to deal with through that, while you also see it's a very slice of life story. You're seeing other characters who are probably not anywhere near worthy, but you get to see the interplay between that. And that was really important for me to play off of. And then the third POV in the first book is Katyam, who's a physician She came by the job because she's great niece to the elderly characters who are in the book, and she just wants choice in her life. So, juxtaposed to Jinnid, who's trying to go under the will of his god, Katiam wants to be free of the responsibilities that she's never felt she had a choice on under. And then sitting between those are the two siblings, Ralia and Hanan and Ralia, who are just trying to figure out what their purpose in life is, period. So you add to that, I know we're going long here. The elevator's already gotten to the ground floor.
It's just like the Willy Wonka elevator.
Right. That there's a lot of interplay coming both from the Pantheon, which has a huge interaction, and people who decided to basically screw it, I want to do what I want. And so you get a lot of several villains who are just out to kind of mess things up, Joker style, all acting as juxtaposition to our main characters. So in the end, it's a giant epic of what is faith. It would be probably a very good a good pitch for it on one line, but it's also, you don't sort of see it till you don't really start to see it till book 2, but it also is a lot about generational shift. And as one generation is leaving, how do they leave legacy to be picked up by the next generation? So we're seeing a generational shift between those, as opposed to say like Thiago's book, which is about dealing with death. I'm kind of dealing with how does one good generation hand off, whether for good or for ill, the responsibilities to another generation, and how does that one pick up the torch? So, yeah.
So, what makes Deathless Beast different than other epic fantasy books similar in style?
Similar would be scope. The easy answer on difference would be I removed all normal animals from the whole world, and then removed all the normal fantasy non-human cultures as well, and replaced them with my own, more for my sake than anybody else's. What also separates it from others is I kind of tried to capture a timelessness era, as opposed to a specifically high fantasy era, or specifically Middle Ages, or specifically Age of Enlightenment. It's kind of a melange of cultural areas all interplaying without ever, someone may correct me, but feeling anachronistic in that sense. Yeah. And my scope, while large and epic, never actually comes out that far. It all stays very much grounded in what's happening at the moment of what you're very, very in media res, on foot next to who you're dealing with, which is true of all of what I write. I try to let big things happen often just off screen, in the way of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. The play happens in the sidelines of Hamlet occurring. And I just love that idea of writing in the marginalia. And that's where my stories like to take place, is in the marginalia, except when they don't. So, yeah.
So where did you get the idea for Deathless Beast from?
So that was part of that decoupling that I had from my original inspirations. Is I very much originally, back in the 90s, was writing a fanfic. I just didn't know it, nor would I care to admit that. I stand very much on the side of, I think more kids should be writing intentional fanfic, so that they can better decouple themselves from their early writing. And so I had to spend the early 2000s decoupling from thinking my idea was really big, and when I look back at it, nothing happens at all. It's literally just a walking book, because walking, it was stupid. So the inspiration really came from me basically saying, forget this old plot, separating my main point of views, and but the world still existed, so the story kind of wrote itself. Jinnid was a secondary character, and by me giving him his own plot, it suddenly became this giant plot that the other plots acted as side dishes, even though his is also a main dish. But that has to do with me changing dials on who's main character at what point. So that's where it kind of came from, was Jinnid's new story inspired Hanan's new story, and decoupled it away from it being just a really bad retelling of the Bulgariad. And so now it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. But so yeah, that's where it came from. It originally was both Deathless Beast and Bone Shroud were one 175,000 word book, and that's what I originally pitched to agents. And what little feedback I got back was it's too long, and so I split the first 2/3 off and spent 6 months basically fever dreaming how to fix it until it fixed itself, which allowed the other third to grow into a full novel too. So it came from a lot of reinvention and doing what most people tell you not to do. And that's, if your original story was bad, just scrap the whole thing. And I said, I'm too stubborn to. And so I spent several years rewriting it until it was cohesive.
So is it fair to say that at least the main story thread came first and your characters kind of filed in after that?
Simultaneous. The characters have all existed. The only actual change was Ralia. Ralia used to be Raul, and he was a stand-in for me. And so I took Raul and made him a secondary character so that Hannon's story would overshadow and let Raul grow. And then I made a switch to Ralia, and suddenly Ralia wasn't me anymore at all. And it was enough for me to let Ralia exist long enough to prepare herself character-wise for her own story, which will be occurring starting in book 5 is when her plot really takes off. But she needed, that was kind of the last linchpin of decoupling it from the original story. Was I didn't want to just remove Raul/Ralia. I needed to remove me from the story because I was the anchor that was holding it back. Yeah. And so getting out of that way allowed the story to exist. Yeah.
A lot of writers don't see that part. Themselves are getting in the way until it's too late. So
right.
Good job on that.
Thank you. Yeah, like I'm an outliner, but I'm discovering more and more what I do discover. And one of the main things I discover is that I've outlined my world and my plot, but everything that happens in between those bullet points are the characters acting as themselves. Some characters are significantly easier to write. Jinnid, because I didn't finish writing this book until I was in my 30s, Jinnid is so much more me than anybody else now, because he's the 30-year-old version of Andrew, or the 30s-year-old version of Andrew. Whereas someone like Katiam is very difficult for me to write because I have nobody in my life who she is exactly, that I can say, oh, she's totally inspired by so-and-so. She's not. So she requires a lot more that I not pour soul into it, but kind of I have to find whole cloth to cut her from.
Right.
Which often then makes me have to do a lot less revisioning on her work, because I'm mulling so long and hard on her work that by the time it finally hits the paper, she does what she needs to do in the story. Whereas Jinnid, I have to go back and say, okay, I got to pull. That's too much of me in there. That's just me talking to Dane. Stop that. And how do you change it? And so, there's a lot of revision in the characters that are too close to me. So.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our spoiler chat. Yeah. So anyone out there that hasn't read Deathless Beast yet, if you don't want to be spoiled, this is your warning. But if you're here for the Thrice chat, you can just put us on mute, because we're going to talk about Thrice after we finish with Deathless Beast, and we'll have a banner up saying, now you can come back.
Make yourself some tea, steep it for 5 minutes. Yeah.
Go read a little bit of Deathless Beast and then come back. So spoilers for Deathless Beast. Mm-hmm. You were talking about how Jinnid was one of the easier characters for you to write, which ties in perfectly, because my first spoiler question is, who were some of your favorite characters and or easiest characters to write? So do you have others in addition to Jinnid?
I love writing Dorian. Maida is fun too. So his wife, because they are very much inspired by my grandparents. I was very blessed to have 4 loving grandparents. I still have 1 grandmother left. But my 2 grandpas especially, one took me camping, and Pop took me camping, and then Bompa, who Dorian is almost exactly based off of. He had polio when he was 12, and so he basically had no muscles below the waist. So just he had braces, and he actually made braces and prosthetics as a living because of that. So, and he was the most jolly old man and the life of every single party. And not because he was the one talking, but because he was getting people to tell their stories and laughing at their stories. You knew when he was in the audience if you're on stage, because he was in the back just roaring with laughter at everything everybody said. And so Dorian was very much based on him. Yeah.
So you mentioned how Katya was one of a hard character for you to write because she wasn't based off of anyone. Were there other characters that were equally hard to write for you?
Hannon was for a long while. He's come to grow. I mean, he has the biggest growth arc in the whole series because he's kind of a dummy at times. But he can be hard to write because he's so clinical and I'm not. And so I have to really examine where his mental analysis is, and why he decides to make a decision or chooses not to make a decision, because that's his other weakness, is his indecision at times. And so he's good at reacting, probably better than he admits, but he's not so good about actually proactively making the decision, because he's overthinking way too much. And I have a lot of friends I've known who, I was a board game designer for a few years, and you get somebody in the playtest who just drags your playtest down because their analysis paralysis take an hour to make a decision. Well, that's Hannon. And so I've had to pour a lot of that into him, which can be hard because you're like, okay, but you need to do something, dude. We've got to get this story going. So would you please make a decision? So somebody else makes a decision, and you have to decide, did that ruin the plot? Because now is your hero not being a hero?
Right.
But that's also, you can add that into a tragic story too. Is when is the tragedy triangle of bully to coward, coward to bully, or hero to bully or coward, and what does that entail? And so he's difficult to write at times. Soraya is hard to write, and not because she's blind. I really enjoy writing her scenes because I get to. I had a scene. It won't spoil anything, but in book 3, she comes down out of a pass and she smells spring of the city as people are sweeping out their houses, and she smells the dust. And my editor said, she can't be smelling dust. Nobody smells dust. Let's have her smell someone putting flowers out. And I'm like, just because you can't smell dust doesn't mean that is literally my life. And my allergies aren't as bad as when I was younger, but I love the smell of good dust, or like even better, an old library, right? Like the dust that comes off of books is perfection, and moldering leather. So the chance to be able to close my eyes and describe scenes and try to describe people who she can't see walking up to her, that who they are by the way their herd mannerisms, is important. Yeah. But she can be harder to write, because she has a different indecision than Hannon does, and that's that she has a lot poured onto her shoulders over the course of the series, and so a lot of her indecision is her bracing herself, kind of going into a freeze. She definitely has a freeze reaction to issues, and how do you deal with that in a story that doesn't freeze up the plot? So,
right.
Yeah.
If someone says they can't smell dust, they haven't spent enough time in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes. Yes, that's very true.
I
don't know where you're at, but I'm from Spokane, Washington, and allergies are nuts.
Oh, absolutely. Now I'm in North Carolina, where I have another set of allergies with the pollen. Yes. But I spent almost 6 full years out in northwestern Idaho, and right on the Palouse border. And
wasn't the allergies get worse for you there when you were there?
My dust allergies did.
Yeah. There are people who move to Spokane who have no allergies, and they become bad. Like they just exist. Yeah, it's bad.
And then they kind of switched when I moved down to North Carolina, and now like the dust and the mold allergies are tampered down by the pollen allergies.
Right.
Like
right.
You could definitely smell dust though.
Yeah.
We have a question from the crowd.
Yes.
Quinn wants to know, what is it like writing Dane?
It's actually really fun. Dane, Jinnid was actually originally Dane. Like, it wasn't his name, he was Jinnid, but his character, like 2010, the story was Rawl and Soraya and Jinnid traveling, and Jinnid being a chauvinist brat, and Soraya putting him in his place, and it was just it was campy two-dimensional characterization. So when I decoupled him and then gave him Dane as his shadow, Jinnid suddenly grew into a character because he had Dane to be his foil. And so Dane's really fun to write, not because it's fun to write him, but because it's fun to write everybody putting him in this place. Because we all know a Dane, whether and not necessarily chauvinist, whether they're just the dude who knows better than you all the time, and you so want to speak up and say something to him, but he's your boss, or you so want to say something to him because like a friend of mine, he was from the Navy, and he goes, oh, we had a bunch of those guys. I would never play cards with him, but he's absolutely who I would trust to have in battle next to me because he's really good with a gun, but I ain't going to talk to him. And that's who Dane is. Dane is very good in battle, but he's an absolute zealous prick. And the fact that I let my characters put him in his place, but I also allow my leadership to say, you know what, just put up with him for one more month. He'll be gone, I promise. That's what happens in real life. And so I wanted to try to capture that. But I have a lot of fun doing that, because then it's also fun to aggravate the characters who are trying to do the right thing, because their leader says, he's not hurting anybody yet. He might grow up. Give him a little time. But please, thank you for saying that though. But maybe next time talk to me first.
Yeah.
It's a bit of wish fulfillment, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to switch from talking about characters to talking about scenes.
Yeah.
So do you have some favorite scenes that you had to write in Deathless Beast?
Well, the easy answer would be I love writing my campfire stories, and I try to include 2 full-on set-aside stories, whether they're part of the plot or not. I just love writing them, and I set aside whole days to just write them. I that actually comes from me being upset with the fact that in Belgariad there's actually only one story, and that's in the first 5 chapters. Wolf tells the story of Battle of Omimbre. Other than that, there's mentioned histories, but there's no sit-down stories. And like, it was such a formative moment when he tells the story. Like, why aren't these through the entire story? Right. Patrick Rothfuss puts in moments of music, and all he's doing is describing how the music's being played, but you're there. And I was like, and it's constantly through the whole entire series. So I wanted that. And so I put those in my book. And if I get to the end of a book and I realize I've only written one, I have to go find a place to put a second one in to make sure that there's at least 2 stories being told and at least 1 new board game introduced. So I love writing those. My favorite scene to write in Deathless Beast is probably the interlude where Gorizioni is made king of the Wyloths. Mm-hmm. That was really fun to write. That was a late entry, and I really loved writing that one. Yeah.
I think my favorite scene, or at least the one that sticks out to my mind the most, is when the seed kind of comes to life.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And then our characters have to figure out what's going on. Why is this thing moving on its own? And
right. Yeah.
I love a good.
Excuse me.
So on the other side, were there any scenes that were super hard for you to write?
That's a very good question. Yeah, the planning and the writing of the battle with Gold Eater, that took quite a bit of planning and rewriting to get it to work right. Obviously, battles are not my strength. I'll freely admit that. So I do have to do a lot of extra planning and then and rewriting to make sure they don't feel like it's just beat for beat. Or just feels like a one paragraph Helm's Deep.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you hope for writers to come away with after reading Deathless Beast?
Don't world build as much as me. It's been a long discussion between all of my friends, is that, and especially when you compare the two series, which we can get into later, but like I planned from 93 on, and I spent a lot of college writing notes. I have notebooks of sketches and drawings for collation background, but it was too much, and it's because I had world builder syndrome, which was the bane of all of fantasy writers, because we often use world building as an excuse to not write. Yeah. And we need to get to writing and do the world building when it's important. I had to rename gods because I had names that were so derivative from other fantasies. They were literally pulled wholesale, and I forgot that I had done that as a kid, and I needed to rename them. So I had a lot of reinvention things, which requires a lot of rehacking your own brain to remember what a new character's name is. I mean, it's one thing to switch a character from Rawl to Rawlia, which is a lot of work. So you got to go through and make sure, is this something that they would say if now they are no longer the little brother, now they're the little sister? It does change things. It changes, and it automatically, even without doing a translation of the moment, can utterly alter the scene itself. Yeah. Just by foreknowledge, because of earlier scenes, that now she's a girl. So, but getting to writing as soon as you can, not that means you need to write so you can get done, but just that you're not stuck in the world building trenches for too long, because when you need to know the thing, you'll come up with the thing. You don't need to know ahead of time how all the coinage works until you do. Yeah. It's still fun to do, absolutely. And if you're really bored, you can always do world building. But if you're falling to the point where your world building is getting in your way, it's probably getting in the story's way too.
Yeah. Good to know. Well, now I want to switch gears and talk about Thrice.
Yeah.
Which I just finished maybe an hour or two before we went live.
Yep.
And so Andrew is aware I gave Deathless Beast 3 stars. Thrice came over better for me.
Good.
It's kind of balancing the 3.5, 4-star range for me right now. Yep. But that's just kind of my immediate. I always have like an immediate rating as soon as I finish where my brain's at, and then I go through the call pile system of all the different categories and come out with like a final rating. I haven't gotten to that yet because I was trying to prepare for this. Yeah. But the full review will be coming soon. But I really, about when we were at about 50-60% in through Thrice, I was sucked in. And I was messaging Leslie at the Nerdy Narrative the whole time. And I was like, okay, I just hit the moment where like I need to know what happens for the rest of this book. And all the other books, you know, I see you there. I see you judging me, but I need to finish this book.
You know, I've seen about 50% of people love the first half and they're like, is this over? And then the second half, they're like, okay, let's just get to the end. And other people are like, it took till half, and then I'm just off to the races. Like, you know what? I can accept half and half. I've read Bartleby the Scrivener. I can accept one Scrivener being good for first half of the book and the other Scrivener being better in the afternoons.
I could appreciate what you were doing in the first half of the book.
Yeah.
And I could see kind of, you know, where it was going to take us. But it was a lot of traveling, and I'm like, okay, we're going to this place, and now we're going to this place, and he's doing this. And we'll get into details once we get into spoilers. But it was like, okay, I need something to actually happen in order to justify all of this. And then when it did, I was like, okay, now I'm here for the long run.
Yep.
So these characters are going to, or these questions are going to seem very familiar, because I use the same questions because I'm not that creative, even though I have a whole degree in it. So for Thrice, would you give us your elevator pitch for what Thrice is all about? Why should we should read this?
So Thrice is a Slavic fantasy, Slavic-inspired fantasy of a father and son on the road. And the father is just trying to do the right thing. And his son, who's only a little 4-year-old, has magic and far too much of it, and people want it. And rather than staying hidden on the run, he basically decides to go straight for the throat of the enemy and just ask them nicely to stop, even if nicely needs to be at the point of a blade. And that's the whole plot, is him just kind of telling them to stop and leave him alone because he just wants to be a father to his son.
He does say please.
He does, yes.
So what makes Thrice different than other books along the same veins?
It's shorter. I intentionally wrote a much shorter, fast clip book. It's very small scope. The whole continent of Balatar that it takes place on is as big as Crimea, which is as big because it's Slavic, but it's also as big as Wales. And so I kind of had to struggle with, how do you write something in such a small scope? I was so used to big, but there's plenty of small scope stories. I mean, a great example would be Hob, right? Yeah. The 7 duchies, of which he basically only spends all of it in 2 cities. So very small scope. And so I kind of challenged myself to write a small scope. I mean, Arthur takes place in Wales, right? And if you have everything within 50 miles of the ocean, you can write small scope stories that feel as epic as an epic. So it is smaller. It's small scope is the huge change. I really wanted that in what I was writing, and the whole series all takes place on that small little area. Yeah, that's a huge difference, and the fact that I went for a Slavic inspiration as opposed to just doing a straight European inspiration. We obviously have some big European, Eastern European stories like The Witcher and stuff that are big, but it hasn't become an official subgenre yet, even though they've been around for forever. There's always been Slavic fantasies, but they've never emerged in the way that Cozy is right now as a sub. And so I did kind of write it selfishly and said, you know what, it's not big yet, but it could be next.
Yeah.
And didn't even know what The Witcher was when I wrote it. And it was actually Brandon Sanderson himself told me, this sounds like The Witcher. And I'm like, okay, I'll look that up. Yeah.
To me, it kind of reminded me of The Road by Cormac McCarthy, but with magic.
Yes, which I DNF'd. I could not finish The Road. But The Road is also a similar story to Lone Wolf and Cub, Mandalorian. Lone Wolf and Cub's inspiration, Road to Perdition, was inspired by Lone Wolf and Cub. Logan. So the story of Man and Boy on Road is such an old, timeless tale that when I set out to write it, I said I'm going to write a Russian Lone Wolf and Cub and see what happens. I did almost no world building in preparation for it by design, because I wanted to just get going on a new story that wasn't in my normal setting.
So is that where you got the idea from?
Yeah. I was rereading a whole lot of Usagi Yojimbo, which is a comic anthropomorphic rabbit. And it is told in that vignette story of every issue is a whole new story. And they can be read standalone, but they tell an entire scope. And I've compared the pacing of Thrice to Netflix pacing. You know, Netflix tells, especially the superhero stories. So pre-Witcher, like Daredevil and stuff, you get a comic book. If we were reading comic book, we would say it's 2 trade papers, right? It's a 1 year's worth of stories, and each 6 months is 1 full arc. So I wanted to write one that felt like every 2 chapters felt like 1 comic book, and had a drop at the end of each one, so that you could lead story to story to story to moment to moment to moment. Some moments of normalcy mixed with moments of action. And so that was a huge inspiration and a way for me to lay it out to get going. Like I had started it, I think I started it for NaNoWriMo in 2018. And then kept going through January, and so wrote the whole story in 3 months. But I basically, in middle of October, had started a new job, wanted to start a new story, and said, I have 2 weeks to prep. And I prepped for 2 weeks and then went as hard as I could for 3 months and wrote the whole story with very little world building prep and made it up as I needed it. Yeah.
So I want to go into spoiler chat now.
Yeah.
So if y'all haven't read Thrice yet and you don't want to be spoiled, put us on mute and come back for the last bit of our chat. But if you have read it, then feel free to put your questions or comments in the comments and we'll get to them when we can. So as I asked for Deathless Beast, who are your favorite or who are the easiest characters for you to write in Thrice?
Slant. So Slant is my desire to see Silk have his own book from Belgariad. There were talks online years ago, and people said, "Will you please write a story about Keldar, about Silk?" And Edding said, "I will never write about anybody but." He wrote Belgarath and Polgara the Sorceress as prequels. I will never write about anybody else, or I have to write about all of them. And the online response was kind of, "We're not asking for all of them. We just want Silk." And it's assumed that's why he wrote Redemption of Alphalis, because it's more Silkish than Belgarath.
Right.
Anyway, so when I put Slant in, I said, you know what? I'm going to put Silk in this, and we're going to work our way towards, maybe we'll do a whole book of like an Ocean's 11 with Slant as the main character. And of course, when I do that, when I put characters or even people I know into books, I usually do that as a shorthand to launch them off. I can't think of any character who has ended up as the person I use to inspire them, because it's kind of like casting. Like, we talk about fan casting a movie. Who would you have play this in? Who would you have play Vin? Who would you have play Kelsier? And everybody's got their favorite choice, and they may say, you know what? Yeah, we're going to get Nathan Fillion to play Kelsier, or to play in my case CERN. And yeah, I would probably do that, but that doesn't mean I would want him to play Castle. I want him to play CERN, but I want Nathan Fillion to be the voice behind it. And so you end up with that kind of, that interplay between the actor and the character. And I did the same thing. I put Silk in and allowed him to become a very different character, even if he has similarities, because he is a trope, right? And so he was very easy to write because he's just so much fun to write. Yeah.
And who were the hardest characters for you to write?
I had a hard time nailing Zin down. I feel like by the end he kind of grew into a character, but he did start off as more two-dimensional than what he ended up as, and more. He of course has more growth into book 2. He was harder to write, but overall it wasn't a very difficult book to write. Leaf was very easy to write because I had a 4-year-old at the time who was asking lots of really big questions. So writing a 4-year-old who waxes philosophical was just natural to put in for me. But overall it wasn't a very difficult story to write. There was a little bit in the final chase towards the end that required a little bit of fluffing up because it was too fast at the time. So I had to do some kind of characterization in there. So it was almost more of just a harder book to expand to where I needed it to be than Collation, which is really, it's easy to expand 150,000 word novel into 152.
Zin was one of my favorites because whenever he was on the page, you knew something was about to happen, whether it was good or bad, something was going to happen.
Yeah. I think Slant likes to think that he's chaos, but I think Zin is actual chaos and personified. Yeah.
So I want to switch gears and talk about our scenes now.
Yep.
What were some of your favorite scenes to write?
Any scene with Guthru in it, the bear. He is so much fun to write, and I'm sad he's not in book 2, but he will be in book 3. But he is so much fun to write because he surprised me too that he was a bear when he shows up, and I really love the pool scene when he gets into the pool. You still don't know that he's the bear, that he's a bear, that he's a bear man. You don't know that, and it was a fun scene to write because I know when I'm writing it, and how can I veil it in a way that when you do finally see him, you're like, well, of course he was. Why didn't I see that? And so I tried to do that. Well, you know, some people may guess it early, but if they don't, it's a good surprise to give them.
I love that in the pool scene, he was just like, you know what? Don't worry about it. You will see me when you need to. You don't need to see me. Don't worry.
Yes.
He was so casual about it.
He was. Yeah. Because what does he have to fear?
Right.
He's a bear.
So, what were the hardest scenes for you to write?
The hardest scene is actually, in the end, my actual favorite scene, which is the very last scene in the book. And hard because I think I cry every time I read it on page or out loud. It was a hard scene to read out loud because it's just where it needed to land as what was written as a standalone. That could there be sequels afterwards? Yes, there are. But could there have been sequels? There didn't have to be. And so, yeah, that was a hard scene to write. When Joven actually has to rip open his chest and show his heart, he doesn't hesitate to do it, but you know it's painful, and we don't know why, and so that's what makes it hard to do is seeing a man like him expose his feelings is very satisfying, but is difficult.
So now I want to switch gears and talk about the future of your series or writing project. So you just came out with, I think you said it was a prequel novella?
For Sphinx, yep.
Sphinx.
That's Fleeting Word, and that takes place 60 years before Collation Saga, as the Protectorate Wars are ending. And Protectorate Wars are kind of referred to often in the series, but they are the defining World War II moment that all the old characters experienced 60 years earlier. So it's basically, I'm calling it the postlude of the Protectorate Wars and the prelude to Collation Saga, because it takes place as the announcement is the war is over. And so you get a even more slice of life cozy story than I've written before. So that just came out, and that one's free through my newsletter. The audiobook is not ready yet because I have other actual paying jobs I have to finish first. So that's my novella I just came out with, is Fleeting Word. And then we just revealed on Friday the cover for Collation Book 3, which is Gloves of Eons, and that book releases on the 28th of this month.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You mentioned a book 3 for the Needle and Leaf series.
Yes. So I'm writing Collation 4 right now. As soon as I finish that and it starts heading off to betas, I will be writing the conclusion to Needle and Leaf. I would like to see it in May, June, but it will probably be summer, I think, before that comes out. Yeah.
So how do you balance writing 2 major series at once?
So I balance it because I always try to work on multiple things at a time, because it lets me separate myself while things are off at beta readers.
Mm-hmm.
I do an alpha and a beta read, and then edits in between each one. So when I send it off to my alpha readers, they read it in about 2 weeks, and give me my feedback, and so I can do some edits and clean some things up before I send it off to betas, who usually get it for 2 to 3 months. And that separates me entirely from the story. So when it does come back, I'm like, oh yeah, what's this book I wrote? And I can actually take their notes and make some changes to it. If you're not working on 2 projects, then you're kind of sitting there hitting refresh for 3 months straight, and that's not healthy. So I do another project so that I can then spend those 3 months working on the next book that I'm writing that is separate from it. So I will probably, like during alpha read for Dread Knight, which is Collation 4, be outlining the end of Needle and Leaf. And then when it goes out to betas, I will probably be so rearing to go, I'll probably tear through tear through the words and finish that off. And I have a couple other projects I want to work on too, but these need to take priority because
Right.
Needle and Leaf will conclude, and then Collation 4 will not be the conclusion. There's 8 in the main series, but it'll be a break. It'll be a full stop, and then I'll have a couple other projects before I even write book 5, which is the second half of the story. Okay. But it'll be a full stop.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, those are all the questions that I had for you. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to discuss?
Well, like I said, Gloves of Eons comes out at the end of this month. It's available on Amazon right now for pre-order for ebook, and then tomorrow on Silverstone's bookshop.com, silverstones.com, the pre-order for signed physical copies will go up. So if you want to get a physical through Silverstones, you can pre-order that starting tomorrow. And audiobooks will be available at the same time as release, because I record my own audiobooks, and that will be those files are already up there, so they're just waiting for release date. So if you prefer audiobook, you can absolutely get it, including through Audible. So if you do Whisper Sync, you can do an immersive read. But yeah, that's what's coming up for me right now. Of course, be keeping an eye out for all those competitions that, and we'll see who's going to win. Yeah,
awesome. And I will have all of the links for all the books that we talked about today in the description below, so you guys can go get those if you don't have them yet or to come. Andrew, thank you for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you to everyone out there who has joined us either live or is watching this back later. I think this has been the most views I've gotten during a live show.
Nice.
So I think at one point we had like 7 people watching.
Nice.
Join us next week. We'll have Delaney Andrews on talking about her book, Silhouette and the Shadow, which I'm really excited to start tonight. So thank you again, Andrew, for joining me today, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you.